you know this friend? And I said, yeah, I know that guy. He's my friend and my colleague. Cortright and George Lopez, another professor here, have also written and co-edited a series of major works on multilateral sanctions. And I think it's important to sort of recognize David is not just coming at this purely from observation, but he's been a public advocate for decades for disarmament and the prevention of war. As an active duty soldier during the Vietnam War, he spoke against that conflict. In 1978, Cortright was named executive director of SANE, the Committee for a Sane Nuclear Policy. And he also actively involved in the nuclear freeze movement in the 1980s. In 2002, he helped create Win Without War, which is still a major peace movement in the United States that opposed the invasion of Iraq and works for demilitarized national security strategies. So that's David, who will be sharing his paper today, or his work on peace, protest, and policy. And now let me introduce also David Griffith, who will respond to David Cortright. Dave Griffith is an academic advisor and holds the rank of assistant advising professor here at Notre Dame with a special interest in advising students. Prior to joining the College of Arts and Letters here, he served as vice president at Chautauqua Institution, for those of you who know that fabulous institute. And he's helped really direct creative writing programs at a number of different universities. He is the author of A Good War is Hard to Find: The Art of Violence in America, which is a collection of essays reflecting on how images of violence in film, literature, and in news media shape our collective understanding. His most recent research is focused on the intersection of Catholic social teaching and popular culture, looking specifically at poverty and creativity. And with that, I'll invite David to come to the podium and to share with us.
Thank you. Thank you, Lisa, very much. Thank you all for coming. Appreciate your participation in this discussion. I especially want to do a shout out to my guests and friends from Pittsburgh, Amy Wonders-Kavanaugh, Louise Horvath, and David Horvath. They come all the way from Pittsburgh just for this. Well, they are also sticking around for an athletic event on Saturday. But I really appreciate that being here. Yeah. But today we'll focus a lot on the nuclear danger and the decisive moment that we're at in the nuclear age now, 80 years since the first bombings, a time of very significant peril with an accelerating global arms race. I like to say, sadly, that the bomb is back, and the U.S. is part of that whole arms build-up, rebuilding and upgrading all of U.S. nuclear weapons. Russia, of course, is building up weapons, making nuclear threats. China is a rising nuclear power, not to mention the other states, North Korea, Pakistan, India, Israel, Iran. And then the New START agreement to limit nuclear weapons, the last remaining agreement on nuclear arms control, is about to expire. So it's a really challenging moment, but I think it's also a moment of opportunity. And I'll say a lot about that. There's more public concern about the nuclear threat today. The Oppenheimer film a couple years ago made an impact. And now there's a new Netflix film is about to come out. It's called House of Dynamite. And it'll be streaming release on October 24. I haven't seen it yet, but I'm told that it really packs a wallop in terms of describing the perils of relying on nuclear weapons. And then just a couple of weeks ago, President Putin in Russia made this very welcome statement that Russia would be willing to hold the line on existing nuclear weapons even after the treaty expires if the US does the same. And then Trump said the other day that this sounds like a good idea, so maybe there's hope that we could hold on to the current levels and not accelerate and go into a full-scale arms race. And all of this is happening now in real time. So the discussion we're having today could not be more relevant. And I want to also add in our discussion today the challenge of trying to stop the invasion of US cities by the White House. I think we'd be remiss if we didn't talk a little bit about that and its implications for war and peace right here in our own country. My core proposition in this discussion and in almost all of my work on social movements is that the political power necessary to halt the arms race and to prevent the invasion of our cities, is not going to come from Congress or the political establishment in Washington. At least not now. We've changed the political alignment. The impetus for change must come from the bottom up, through the mobilization of democratic forces and advocacy and social grassroots movements. But today I'll begin with telling some of my own personal story, my journey to peace studies. I'll review some of the findings of my new book, Cambridge University Press, Protest and Policy in These Peace Movements. I'll focus mostly on the nuclear freeze movement because that's the relevant challenge we face today. And I'll try to identify opportunities for changing current policy and reversing the arms race. So I'll begin with a story. I think many of you have heard this, but I'd like to tell it anyway. How I ended up being interested in peace because I was drafted to fight into the US Army during the Vietnam War. 1968 was an unfortunate time to be an available young man in America. The war in Vietnam was at its peak, raging intensely, and the military draft to find more troops, more cannon fodder for that war was also at its peak. I graduated from Notre Dame in 68. I got home 3 days later, I received my military draft notice. And within a few weeks, I was in the Army. And before then, I wasn't really very political, conservative Catholic kid, grew up in a small town in Pennsylvania. But here I am in the Army, and maybe on my way to Vietnam, what's going on, I began to read and study. I talked to the veterans who were coming back from the war at the coffee shops, base where I was stationed. And the more I learned, the more horrified I was, the more I realized we had been lied to by our political leaders about this war. And I went through a crisis of conscience. I couldn't believe that I had somehow fallen into this dire situation. And how could I be part of a war that I knew to be so profoundly unjust and immoral? So I decided, well, I'm just going to speak out against the war as an active duty soldier. I don't care what they do. I just can't in good conscience go along with this. This is late 68, early 69, and there's already starting to be an anti-war movement within the military and among veterans. So I became part of that. And this was a poster I was asked to pose for this in a New York studio. The artist, you can't read it very well from the distance, but it's Richard Avedon, a great photographer. I had no idea who he was, so I didn't know enough to be nervous in the presence of the great master. But so this was part of my experience during the war, and that led me to be committed to working for peace, set me on a path towards peace research and advocacy, and I haven't veered from that all the years since. During the course of studying and researching in the early years of my work, I became intensely interested in Gandhi and the power of nonviolence, strategic use of nonviolence. I went to India several times, studied at the Gandhi National Museum, met some of Gandhi's fellow participants in the freedom movement, met some of his grandchildren, and really began to see and understand the importance of nonviolence and especially the strategic use of it. You know, Gandhi is a difficult person to understand. I went to the museum and they have a little box there which contained all of the possessions that Gandhi had at the end of his life. Some eyeglasses, some sandals, a few papers, and that was it. He owned nothing. He had no power. He had no real influence in terms of in political power. He was a strict vegetarian. He was celibate. He had hardly any clothes on. And Churchill famously mocked him as being half naked. So it seemed like a very humorless guy. But there are some stories, so I'll tell one. When Gandhi was in London in 1931 for the conference that began the long, slow process of Indian liberation, he was invited to the palace to meet the king. So on the appointed hour, he showed up in his usual, he had a cloak and loincloth, and that was it, sandals. And of course, very blustery London day. And the reporters are gathering and say, "Mr. Gandhi, don't you think you're a little underdressed for the occasion?" And he said, said, well, that's right, His Majesty has on enough clothes for both of us. And he was also asked, Mr. Gandhi, what do you think of Western civilization? He said, I think it would be a good idea. So, but the learning and applying Gandhi's methods, of course, that's what Dr. King did, Cesar Chavez, and so many others, and it's still to this day the model of social resistance that's most effective, and we'll talk a lot about here. And as I mentioned at the outset, I really want to focus in on the nuclear disarmament movement part of the study that I did. This is a Cambridge book, Cambridge Elements. These are either very long articles or short books, depending on how you fill up. So, and I really do focus a lot on the nuclear movements. And throughout our history of the atomic age, it's always been social movements that have been responsible for any progress towards change. Right at the beginning of the atomic age, the atomic scientists, the ones who built the bomb, tried to stop it from being developed further, and then successfully campaigned to at least have the nuclear program under civilian control, not under military control. And then there were major movements in the late 50s and 60s to stop nuclear testing because of the radioactive fallout and the effects of accumulation of strontium-90 in the bones and teeth of children. And then, of course, the big movements of the 70s and 80s in which I participated and which I'll say more about here. Part of what I see in understanding and trying to study these movements is that activists rarely understand any success or see that they're making any success. I was talking to a colleague the other day, and we had these big demonstrations and nothing happened. And even now, we're having these marches for no kings and hands off. Millions of people are participating. It's really a major era of citizen mobilization, and it doesn't seem to be having any impact. The occupant of the White House is not any saner or less tyrannical in his policies. But we have to understand that movements have their impact in uncertain, subtle ways. And even when we think nothing is happening, changes can come around. And they emerge in unexpected ways. One of my favorite writers is Rebecca Solnit, and she wrote once, it's always too early to calculate effect. The effects of movements go on through the years. And one of the movements that I was privileged to be part of is the nuclear freeze, as I mentioned, and this is the big rally in New York City Central Park. This is on the Avenue of the Americas going into the park. And I was one of the people who helped to organize that movement. Nearly 1 million people came to the park that day. And also in the nuclear freeze movement, there was a campaign of putting the issue on the ballot. And there were ballot initiatives in 10 states and dozens of cities. 18 million people voted on the freeze in 1982, 60% in favor. And it was just a massive grassroots movement. There were freeze campaigns everywhere, in every town and city. And there was a relentless presence and pressure applied against politicians. And I argue that it really had a significant effect. Initially, the Reagan administration, the White House, attacked the freeze, but the movement was just too popular and too big to ignore. And Reagan was forced to respond. And the administration toned down its bellicose rhetoric and began to promise negotiations with the Soviets. And over time, the nuclear saber rattling of the White House gave way to messages of moderation and support for arms control. And all of this occurred in the period from 82 through 84. And this was before Mikhail Gorbachev came to power in the Soviet Union. The change was the result of a power of protest and the changing of public attitudes here in the US. And then Reagan won re-election in 84, in part by co-opting the freeze message and portraying himself as the peace candidate. The freeze campaign coordinator at that time, a dear colleague, Randy Keeler, observed the Ronald Reagan who was elected in 1984 was completely different than the Reagan of 1980. And the freeze campaign created a political climate conducive to arms reduction, and the president adjusted his sails accordingly. And we began to see real significant arms reduction after Gorbachev came to power and the negotiations continued. And all this really was the result of this mass movement And I think just a moment to observe and comment upon the role of faith communities, all manner of church and religious organizations in all different denominations conducted educational campaigns, organized conferences, mobilized their supporters. And the US Catholic bishops were the most influential, arguably, in this document. I know some of our students are still studying this, I hope, and a really monumental document. And it wasn't just that there was this important document, but that the writing of the pastoral letter, Challenge of Peace, was itself a major public event. And the administration tried to prevent it, but the bishops were stalwart and principled in their challenge against the Reagan administration policy. So all of this had a significant effect in changing the political climate. So let me talk a little bit now about some of the basic factors of success. Professor Schirch talked about some of this at the outset, about movements can exert influence. And I particularly studied some of the great scholars of this field, Sid Tarrow, sociologist, Charles Tilly, also a great sociologist, Erica Chenoweth, who is the great scholar on civil resistance, and Gene Sharp, who was really the pioneer in studying nonviolent social action, political action. So the principles, I'll just articulate them for you here. Movements succeed when they attract mass participation, especially at the grassroots level. Movements need visionary goals, like a world without nuclear weapons, but we also have to have practical, achievable objectives, such as today, halting the development of more nuclear weapons. The power of movements depends upon building broad and diverse coalitions. Media communications and effective framing of messages and narratives is absolutely essential. It's necessary to engage in institutional politics. We must be in the streets, but we also have to be in the suites and learn how to engage political establishments, both in electoral campaigns and lobbying. And this is critically important now in the United States as we come up on the 2026 midterm elections. The huge protests and mobilizations that have occurred need to be translated into effective electoral action. The potential for fundamental change is there, but it does depend on wise strategy and wise communication on the part of the movement. And then, as I mentioned earlier, the religious community, faith community is critically important as a partner in all social change movements. Charles Tilly, the sociologist, talked about social movements as performative action. I like the term and the concept here, that what we're trying to do in these protests and all the kinds of action, what the bishops were trying to do with their letter, is to create a message and a set of images and themes that convey a different future, a different direction for policy. And I know Dave will talk more about this in his comments. But he boiled it down to these four features: worthiness, that is to say, this has to be something that's for the common good, for the public. We're out there in the streets because we want to save our country from tyranny. We want to save democracy. Unity is critically important. All of these movements need to be integrated. They all have their separate kinds of issues, but there needs to be an integrated campaign and movement. And we are seeing that very much today with the Indivisible group and Move On and others that are leading this movement. I'll say more about that in a minute. It's a good thing, but it's also limiting. Numbers, here we come back to the same concept as I mentioned earlier. Mass participation is key. And then commitment. This is an interesting one. We have to be able to show to bystanders, and really the vast majority of people don't participate in these rallies. We are communicating to them. Our performance is for them. They are the audience. We have to show commitment, our willingness to sacrifice, to be out in freezing cold weather, to protest and stand on the street corner for 2 hours with a sign. You feel kind of awkward and foolish sometimes doing that, but you're there because you're telling other people that you have this commitment. And all of these things together, I think, create a kind of an atmosphere where people are attracted to the movement. A colleague of mine, Cora Weiss, one of the great peace organizers of our time, she used to say, I only want to organize protests that are safe for the children. I want to bring my children. Another person talked about, well, and it's inviting for religious communities and pastors and clergy to come. So these are features that are elements of our effective mobilizing methods. So let me talk now about the specifics of the arms race. I won't go into a lot of detail. Those of you who study these issues know that the SIPRI, Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, annual data book is the reliable source. And they show that the US, Russia, and China have these weapons. China is starting to build more, although it's interesting that China's numbers are way below those of US and Russia. And China has only actively deployed 24 weapons. And this is a policy that they had before, which was they'd build weapons, but they would keep the missiles over there and the warheads over there. And they seem to be still more or less following that approach. So a number of us who've been trying to mobilize public concern about the arms race recently got together and created the appeal to halt and reverse the arms race. Kind of tiny to read there. But basically, this was an attempt to bring together as many groups as possible to say that we're not going to remain silent. We have to speak out against this insanity of the growing arms race. And we're calling on, especially the US and Russia, to halt the building of new weapons. You know, yes, we want to get rid of these weapons, that's the goal. But the first step is to stop the building. And that's been a major challenge that we've been working on. As I mentioned, now we have this additional challenge, and let me just say a few words about the invasion of US cities that's happening. And a number of groups are organizing against this, including Women Without War, the organization that I've been part of, About Face, which is a group of active duty service members and recent veterans, and trying to basically reach out to the members of the National Guard and to help them to understand that this is not an appropriate mission for the military. The slogan is not what I signed up for. There's a couple of other posters that they produced that are now being distributed around these cities, now in Portland and soon in Chicago and all these places. So I think it's a really effective campaign of trying to reach out to the service members. And also I think for the communities, there's a lot of anger when you see the military in the cities. It's almost unbelievable that we're facing troops in our cities. But as activists, we have to act in a restrained way, not to even attack property, the police cars, and police cars that had the tires slashed. Here's the performative aspect. We need to attract the support of masses of people. Most people in Chicago and Portland don't want the National Guard in their city. And if we're smart in organizing and trying to persuade the soldiers and then work with the political leaders in these cities, maybe there's a chance we can stop this. And it's critically important, not just because of what's happening now. It's clear that the White House is doing this to provoke more social resistance and violence. And it's also a rehearsal for what we likely are going to see in 2026. They're going to try to, I would predict, but I hope I'm wrong, that they will be employing troops outside voting centers, particularly in important places, trying to intimidate voters, trying to provoke violence and conflict. So it's a real challenge, and it's going to be with us, sadly, for the next year or two. I think it's something we can defeat, but it will take wisdom and smart strategy. Going back to the nuclear issue, one of the ways in which activists are facing this issue is to understand that the big focus of the No Kings and Hands Off and other protests have been on domestic issues, rightfully so, to save our democracy, to try to prevent the cutting of healthcare that's going on now. And this slogan, I think, is really great. Healthcare, not warfare. And it's a way in which the movements have been trying to participate in the big mobilizations. And there's another one coming up on the 18th. So, but to do so in a way that is supportive of the main goal of fighting for the cuts in healthcare, focusing on our domestic preserving the democracy and domestic society, but to also at the same time bring in the fact that the military is taking up all the resources. And this is one of the messaging issues that's a challenge today. That the money being spent on all of these weapons is being used for those purposes instead of for social opportunity. And I was looking at this bad Republican bill that's been passed and is the center of the debate for the government shutdown. It cuts $1 trillion over the next decade from Medicaid, SNAP, and other vital social programs, nutritional programs for the needy. $1 trillion over a decade. Well, that happens to be about the same amount of money the government's going to spend over the next decade to build up more US nuclear weapons. So you have $1 trillion for nukes and taking $1 trillion away from basic social needs. But focusing on these kinds of warped priorities, I think, is a way for us to work within the movement itself to get people to see this, but also more broadly in society. So just the last few words on the current nuclear dilemma. We can hear from Dave. So as I mentioned, we are at this point where the treaty has been, it's about to expire. It can't be renewed short term. And so the key is to hold on to these restrictions. And there, I think we have some potential opportunity because Trump himself, well, he says so many crazy things you never know what to believe. He has, on a number of occasions, talked about denuclearization. However he means that, we don't know. But what's important about it, I think, is that it's an opportunity for us to engage with some Republicans. Even the king says that nukes are bad and we should get rid of them. And then to do this very specifically in relationship to the offer from Putin to not go above the arms restrictions as long as the US will do the same. So there's quite a bit of a mobilization going on now in Washington among the arms control groups to really try to make sure that we can get from the White House, not just that it's a good idea, but there needs to be a formal statement from the US that we will also not exceed these weapons limits. And then more importantly, is it has to lead to a negotiation, new agreement to halt all weapons for a long period and then to negotiate for deep reductions and leading towards the eventual elimination of all these nuclear weapons. So it's a big agenda. It's a difficult one, but I think that there's a real strategy in front of us and ways to act that can begin to reduce some of these nuclear dangers. Obviously, like all social movements, the prospects of success are uncertain, but I think that we can learn from some of these past movements, apply some of the principles and practices for effective organizing. Maybe we can begin to turn the tide, to pull back from the brink. Everybody should turn out in 2 weeks, is it, for the next No Kings rallies, and we'll be part of this movement. So thank you very much.
Professor Cortright, and now we'll hear from Professor Griffith. Response.
I decided against PowerPoint only because that's the only way I can justify having so many books, especially in the public, and hold them up, say these exist. So, thank you, David, for having me. I also need to thank Dana Moss, professor in political science here at Notre Dame, who connected David and I for this occasion. I'm grateful to her making this introduction. Just very quickly about my own background, because I think it's germane to this conversation and also kind of mirrors the way that David introduced himself, as I too am an alum of Notre Dame from 1998. My dad is an alum from 1973, so we're sort of spanning some time here, overlapping, not quite overlapping. And that's important for me to mention because I do think that Notre Dame, as I don't have to convince you, is unique in its commitment to peace and peace studies. Although I think what peace studies looked like at the founding of the Kroc Institute, what peace studies as a discipline looks like now is probably quite different. I'm not, that's not my area of study. However, I think just in paying attention to the placards and the different kinds of events and lectures given here at Notre Dame over the years, you can see that, at least I've been able to see that change. My introduction to this sort of work, and when I say this sort of work, I mean for myself, I was an English major at Notre Dame, MFA in creative writing from the University of Pittsburgh, so that's one overlap with David and spending some time in Pittsburgh, and being very committed to what I would call a kind of literary tradition stemming from folks like Thomas Merton, Daniel Berrigan, and Dorothy Day, who also wrote quite a lot. Dorothy Day, the founder of the Catholic Work Group, along with Peter Marn. And that their work led me to the publication of the book that was mentioned at the top, Good War is Hard to Find, The Art of Violence in America, which will turn 20 years old coming up. So not quite old enough to drink, but getting there. And it started as this little pamphlet that was published by a book designer in Pittsburgh by the name of Brett Yasko. Brett's a beautiful artist and book designer who's done a lot of work for like MIT Press and other university presses. But it started as this small little book. I was moved, as many were, by the Abu Ghraib prison scandal. And you can see this afterwards if you want, but the image on the front of this is a kind of silhouette of the detainee that was put on a box with a hood over his head, and then was led to believe that he was going to be executed, electrocuted or executed through electrocution. And I started writing essays, personal essays, in response to that scandal, which broke in the winter of 2004, because the climate at that time, and I'm going to go over to David's work here very quickly, the climate at that time was having, and the cultural conversation at that time was having a very difficult time, in my view, calling it what it was, what it seemed to be, which is torture. Right? And that's a whole other conversation that we can get into. And so I really started writing about, well, why is it that I'm seeing these things so differently than some of my friends, some of my family? And so, as David says early on in this new book, it was difficult to even find some common ground in terms of language for talking about what we were describing. David starts his book by talking about the difficulty of even talking about peace, of finding a language to even describe it. And as a writer, as someone who's trained in literary arts, that's something that I'm constantly thinking about. What is our common language, right? Because if we don't share a common language or a common sense of definitions, then it's going to be very difficult in terms of the communication piece that is being talked about in terms of what successful social movements, successful peace movements need, right? If we're communicating with trying to gather a broad coalition of people, we have to agree on some sort of language and some sort of terms, and that language cannot just be ad hominem attacks. We have seen that doesn't really get us where we need to go in terms of the divisiveness, especially the climate that we're in right now. So when I was reading David's book, I was thinking about, well, what do successful movements need? And as he articulates in his presentation just now, mass participation, achievable objectives, a broad coalition, communications, and political engagement. Now, though I am no James Baldwin, I am very sympathetic to James Baldwin. If any of you saw I'm Not Your Negro, the documentary about his life and work toward the end of his life, he was working on this opus about King, about Malcolm, about other members of the civil rights movement. And he talks about how ill at ease he was out in the streets. And he felt that he was much more comfortable and could do a lot more good as a writer, right? Now, again, James Baldwin, but when I read that about him, this has been some years ago, I realized that it was okay for me to feel ill at ease standing on the street corner with a sign. That didn't mean that I wasn't responsible for showing up in public and being counted, but it meant that I could lean into the work that I felt I was called to do occasionally as a writer writing about these kinds of issues. So when thinking about communications and how do we use communications of different sorts in order to create mass participation that could lead to achievable objectives and build a broad coalition, enhance political engagement, that's one thing I wanted to think about today in relationship to work that I do, spurred by the work that David has done in this. And Charles Tilley's requirements for effective mobilization, just prior to the bullet-pointed list that David put on the PowerPoint, he talks about engaging in performative actions to convey messages and imagery that are familiar and attract public audiences. So this idea of that being performative, familiar, and attractive, okay? That these movements gain adherence and exert influence through symbolic activities that embody essential values. And when I think about the great works of literature, and I'm going to focus just for a moment in my few minutes that I have left, when I think about the great works of literature that brought me to the point where I've wanted to become politically engaged, they're mainly works that begin during World War II. I would say that John Hersey's Hiroshima is the book that radicalized me. I was in 6th grade. It was on this little spinner rack in the public library in the young adult section, which at that time, young adult meant something very different than it does now. And I remember reading that book, and I've written about this in A Good War is Hard to Find. I didn't know what it was. There was a picture of a mushroom cloud on the cover. I knew a mushroom cloud, I knew the word, but I didn't know anything about how that had affected people. And of course, if you've read Hersey's Hiroshima, that book is a literary, journalistic narrative, decentered, not focused on John Hersey, but on the lives of several people who survived that bomb blast, including a German Jesuit. That radicalized me insofar as now I had some kind of common language, I thought, and common set of images, a common understanding, I assumed, is across cultures, the people that it affected, of the cost of that blast. And it also gave me a rich and disturbing and grotesque set of images that were provocative. If you read that book, and it may have been some time, there's images of women whose bare skin was imprinted, sort of tattooed with flowers from the kimonos that they were wearing. Or there's another moment where the German Jesuit is crossing a bridge and sees someone whose skin was sloughing off their hands. He describes it like gloves. These very just visceral, grotesque images gave me a sense very early on in 6th or 7th grade that this was something that I needed to pay attention to. So when we're thinking about performative action, symbolic activities, I'm thinking much more in terms of a literary sense. Though if I'm out in public and I'm at a rally or a protest, it's not as though I'm immune to that, but I'm constantly as a literary person comparing those up against this rich store of literary gestures, both fictional and non-fictional, that I have. Right? And so how can we, and this is something I think about with my students, how can I help them to build up that rich storehouse of language, that rich storehouse of imagery, that will help them, like Oppenheimer, I think recently has been having that effect. I haven't gotten a chance to, I don't know if House of Dynamite is out yet, but I look forward to that. Of course, there's a whole dissertations have been devoted to the literary output and the filmic output from the Vietnam War, right? These are things that as a younger Gen X person, I experienced in a mediated way, right? I was not alive to witness it myself on the television. I was born in 1975, but I got it in a mediated way later. And so I just wanted to point out just one thing real quick as a suggestion for how I might look at David's work in terms of contributing to this this conversation about successful movements. He quotes Chenoweth talking about the ability of a movement to shape public consciousness and generate support for policy demands, and how that depends on the scale and range of popular participation. And it got me thinking about how to reach a mass audience in a literary and journalistic way, and how that's possible through the press, right? And during the late 60s, there was a burgeoning consumer interest in and market for journalism that eschewed what was considered staid models of neutral objective journalism that borrowed stylistically and conventionally from fiction, often called the new journalism. Behind this appetite was the belief that mainstream, what we now might call legacy media outlets, were incapable of objectivity, were incapable of fulfilling their civic role as the fourth estate. We can look at some data like Rolling Stone magazine when it first came out in 1967 had a circulation of 34,000. And I think like more than half of those got returned and remained. By 1975, at the end of the war, the circulation had increased to 325,000. And you might know Rolling Stone was a venue where Hunter S. Thompson was writing about the Democratic National Convention and violence that took place there. Norman Mailer was writing for Rolling Stone as well. Keith Talese was writing for Rolling Stone as well. Famously, an article about going on an aircraft carrier and interviewing pilots who were doing bombing missions in Vietnam. By the early 70s, Esquire magazine, which in the early 60s had a circulation of 900,000, had a circulation of 1.25 million. Esquire, which is another magazine where famously Michael Herr published his articles that would later become Dispatches, which is this on the ground embedded view of the Vietnam War from his perspective. The visionary goal, as David argues, the visionary goal in these social movements is necessary to motivate activism. But we also need concrete practical objectives as well. This mix of the visionary and the practical in works of long-form investigative journalism and the new journalism, as it was called, is something for future study, and it could be that there are entire dissertations about this. The research that's done so far didn't turn up much. But in literary accounts such as the one I'm interested in, like Mailer, Hunter S. Thompson, Keough, Talese, and the like, Seymour Hersh, who wrote the My Lai massacre story, that these accounts often interviewing people who have no rank or standing in any of the movements, right? Give us a sense of the visionary through what we might call the lyric or poetic descriptions of on-the-ground conditions during the protest. And if you're interested, just Google Norman Mailer Democratic National Convention or Hunter S. Thompson 1972 Republican National Convention in Miami, and you'll see these really, what I would say, grotesque descriptions of the Republican, kind of political machine at that time. By contrast, these hippies marching in the streets. Right? So very divisive still, yet very appealing and appealing to a consumer that were buying these magazines and in many cases launched the literary careers of many people. The forebears of this work are people that we've all heard of before, like Jacob Riis's 1890, How the Other Half Lives, Ida B. Wells' 1895 Red Record, Hemingway, and at the time his wife, Martha Gellhorn's Dispatches from the Spanish Civil War, Evans and Agee's Let Us Now Praise Famous Men from 1941, Percy's Hiroshima from 1945. What all these have in common is that they are doing something that is stylistically innovative and formally innovative, breaking the sort of normal rules of what we would call hard news journalism. In the way that I might bring this home to David's work and thinking about the effective social movements in that communication piece, how do we bring or build a broader coalition? I would turn to and just recommend to you an article by Eric Luschner, that's Leuschner. Eric Luschner is a scholar in the history of the novel, and he has an article from 2019 called Literature of Protest, Literature as Protest, where he makes this distinction between these two things. And it's talking about the way that if we really want to see the kind of engagement and the kind of attraction of people to a movement, that you have to get away from the divisiveness, and then you have to write in a style inculcates empathy for both sides. Why does the young man sign up for ICE? What sorts of conditions brought him to that moment? Why is there someone in a Tyrannosaurus costume bopping around the streets of Portland right now? Right? What led to that germ of an idea in order to perform what they see as their duty as a protester in that form fashion? And when we put that polyphony of voices together within literary journalism or within a long form investigative piece, then we start to get a sense of how these people arrived at the same moment in time in the same place, but on different sides. And so I would just make an appeal, and thank you, David, for your book, because it really got me thinking very much about a new direction for some of the work that I've worked on. So thank you so much.
Thank you. So now we'll open it up for questions and comments from you all in the audience. who would like to share your thoughts, questions? Karen?
No, thank you, both Davids, for this. I mean, I think this is such a timely and important topic. So I'm actually reading a book right now called Bringing the War Home, which talks about some of the other population of Vietnam vets and sort of the ways in which they became sort of militarized and linked with white nationalism. And I'm just curious, I mean, you talked a little bit about your experience in the Vietnam War and the ways in which it sort of led to nonviolent action. But I think we're seeing an increase, particularly in the United States right now, of the ways in which people are really turning to violence. And I think in increasingly ways, and it's becoming more organized, subversive. And I guess I would just be interested in, you know, how do we think about nonviolence in this context when we have both sort of fringe groups that are sort of not just sort of seeing themselves as vigilantes, but actually wanting to take over the government increasingly using violence as a way to sort of silence people who are taking up nonviolent action. It just seems to me it's a really hard place to be in right now, sort of how do we use these lessons that I think are really important historically in peace and in a way that can still be effective and reach our leaders and the general public and sort of demonstrate sort of the continued importance of this philosophy and as a way forward.
Well, it's a real challenge, absolutely. And even in our time, as this book you mentioned addresses, there were many of us, soldiers and veterans, who opposed the war. But there were some who opposed the war in a way that made them susceptible to right-wing ideology. You know, the idea that somehow we weren't allowed to win the war.
Mm-hmm.
Politicians manipulated that. We see this as a general phenomenon. And people in the military are trained in violence. They're conditioned to see violence as the right response. So it's a phenomenon we need to address. And I think a couple of things I would say. First of all, that nonviolence as an approach, as a political practice, as a form of communication is essential no matter what. And so that when we encounter those who have those kind of views, there's nothing we can do but to try to communicate and talk. Shouting and anger will never succeed. That's almost what they want. And to try to communicate. Most of the time, it's not going to be successful the first time or even the fifth time, but it's necessary to stay engaged and use nonviolent communications to try to ask questions. You know, what makes you think this way? Why do you think it's going to be successful? And what about what we were taught in teaching about taking care of the people in need rather than throwing them out into another country, et cetera. So that kind of sustained communication is necessary, and to avoid provocative action. And as I mentioned today, in this administration, we're seeing many attempts to provoke, especially now with the troops in the streets. Can't fall for that bait. And the second thing I would say is that our soldiers and veterans are really a critical audience, and you know, we have more authority because we've been there. I wasn't in combat or anything, far from it, but just the fact that you were in the military, people will give you a little bit more room to talk and to be heard. And so let's use that audience, these groups that I mentioned, About Face, Veterans for Peace, others are out there, and giving them the opportunities to kind of take the lead in discussing these issues, but always urging them to avoid violence and, you know, violent rhetoric and, you know, put downs on things. Yeah, I think these are realities. These struggles are continuous. We don't always win. And even when we win, there are often setbacks. So we have to keep the struggle going. There's an Italian organization years ago that I studied, La Lotta Continua, struggle continues. Yeah. Taylor, the philosopher, talks about this as well. Being persistent and recognizing that there will be setbacks and not being depressed or becoming inactive as a result. Part of our presence in this world is to continually struggle for justice, even when it's almost impossible, or maybe is impossible for the moment.
Thank you. We have another question or comment. Yeah, you, Josefina.
Sorry. Thank you so much. Thank you, David and David, for your contributions. I think this is a very timely and also very important topic. But I wonder, what does in your, or what I understood to be your proposal or your arguments change in the face of an authoritarian regime? Because I think that what we are experiencing now is really the rise. For Latinos like me, it's like, you know, we've survived so many dictatorships that we know how it goes. We know how they take over the media, how they undermine democratic institutions, how they deploy military and armed forces against their own citizens. So these are very, I would say, this is almost like a script of the rise of authoritarianism. And I have if you accept that premise, then for David Griffith, I was wondering, so what do we do now without independent media, without that fourth state? How do you think your thesis would work if there's, obviously, like in any good authoritarian regime, there's a lot of fear of speaking out. But how are we going to do all this without independent media? And for David Cortright, I was wondering, you know, when we think about the successes of nonviolent movements, for example, to bring about the end of the Cold War in Europe, we're always seeing these transnational movements that help nonviolent movements and protests in authoritarian regimes to really gain strength with funding, with political strategies, providing exile. So do you see this now happening in relation to the US? Do you see like there are transnational movements of nonviolent resistance really lending a hand and acting in solidarity with the US? Thank you.
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, briefly, I would say this might be very pie in the sky, but education will remain like foundational to all of this. You know, if we allow our public education, for example, to be eviscerated and turned into some sort of the civic education that at least I heard about when I was a kid, you know, of the 40s and the 50s. We're kind of cooked, as the kids say these days. Universities are now being asked, some are being asked to enter into compacts in competition for money. So I think from my perspective, and I'm looking to people like Henry Giroux on this, who's a Canadian scholar who writes a lot about the neoliberal university. We have to somehow get back to the sort of ideal of the university as an extension of the democratic public square. I'm not suggesting that we engage in any kind of like both sidesism, right? Or balancing departments between right and left or anything like that. But I do think that the rhetoric that our students are steeped in is a rhetoric that is anti-intellectual. I mean, I don't have to convince anyone of that. Right? And so how do we, through the work that we do as scholars and as writers, as I said at the beginning of my response, find a language that threads the needle but not too fine. You know, I mean, it can't be too nuanced, right? Because it won't play. It's like in the theater, if you can't do minute actions up on the stage in the theater, it won't play in the back of the room. For a camera, film camera, yes, it will. But no, that's not what we're talking about. We have to play a longer game, and that's the hard part. The longer games, this is the hard part. So as far as the media goes, and independent media, I mean, we have access to tools mainly for free with our phones, although they're being monitored and data being collected, to produce effective communications and media that'll move people. But we need people who can think strategically through the framework that David is laying out, the kind of framework I think David laying out. So I would say that we need more young people who are looking at a framework like David's and thinking about what makes for effective social protest, but from a communication standpoint.
Well, on the question of organizing for change within authoritarian regimes. The data that Erica Chenoweth and our colleague Maria Stepan have produced, this NAVCO database, it's still being acquired, and there are now many hundreds of cases. And what they find is that nonviolent resistance is more effective than violent, and that it can be effective in authoritarian regimes as much as in democratic states. Seems counterintuitive, but there are lots of examples, of course. South African movement, the being of Eastern Europe, and the end of the Cold War were all these huge movements in a very rigorous communist setting. That's one fact that these methods of nonviolent resistance can work even in the most totalitarian regimes. In World War II, or even in Germany, famous example of the Danish people resisting Nazi occupation takeover. That's one fact. I do think that the transnational dimension is something that's really important. And I did some articles back in the 80s and 90s on the fact that in the US there was the Big Freeze movement, huge. And in Europe, you have this amazing disarmament movement, the biggest movements in Europe in the post-war era. Millions of people participated. And those movements were going in parallel tracks and really were aiming toward the same objective of stopping the arms race and reducing weapons. But there wasn't much actual organic transnational interaction. The demands were different. The European groups did not buy into the freeze idea. They wanted to get rid of all the weapons in Europe. And most of us in the US didn't pay much attention to that. So I don't know what to make of that. I see something similar today. I mean, we're having these very important mobilizations against Trumpism and tyranny for democracy. I don't see a parallel in Europe as much yet. Maybe it will be emerging, but I don't know exactly what form it would take. But it's got to be a benefit to be realized if in our movements here against our own tyranny, we can work in parallel with colleagues in Europe. And European governments are very active, trying to, at least on the Ukraine issue, to prevent the US from completely selling out Ukraine. Maybe there are other issues where we can cooperate. And I think the European civil society is just now coming to the point of realizing that they are being militarized as well. This NATO thing of responding to the threat from Russia by hugely increasing their military spending. This is not something that the European states want to do or have done in decades. Thankfully, we should be glad that Europe is no longer militarized in the history. But it's becoming so now. And so where is civil society? Where are people mobilizing? Find a way to speak against that, to provide alternatives, especially. Because in the NATO decision, there was this curious provision. So they were told they're going to increase their military spending to up to 5% of GDP. Huge amount of increase for the Europeans. But then within that, there was supposed to be 1.5% of it that would go towards civilian infrastructure and civil society. But it wasn't defined. Part of a project, which is think about what that means. Enhance civilian resilience. If Russia is a threat, and Europeans see, then how to respond to it? What's the role of civil society? Can we strengthen democracy and protect ourselves from disinformation? These hybrid warfare operations that Russia is propagating, and they're still going on against us and Europe and other countries. The way you respond to that is by having a stronger civil society or a greater effort to actually find the truth rather than all this disinformation that's flying. Okay, right. So I won't answer but a very important question. And these have to be transnational. These hybrid tools, disinformation are, they're on social media, they go everywhere.
Thank you. We have two more questions. Back of the room and then Sean.
First of all, thank you so much. I've always told my wife there's so much more to nerding football weekend. That we could come here and listen to two insurrections speak is absolutely amazing. One thing Notre Dame did for me was it sent me to Chile in 1976, 77. And so it was 3 years after the coup. As was mentioned, same playbook, same exact playbook that's going on here. Except today, the tools at their disposal are way more sophisticated than what was used back then. And so, unlike you all, who seem pretty optimistic, I am not at all, because this thing is rolling. And if you think there's going to be midterms, I'd like to put money down on that one. But my question to you is personal. How do you get up every day and continue to fight this battle? What do you do? Is it spiritual, or how do you make it happen? Because I admire your resolve so much. And so what's the answer?
Well, I'm a person of faith. I believe that there is a divine order and a moral order in the universe. And King says bends towards justice. Sometimes it doesn't seem that way. A lot of times it's not bending that direction. So I do it because I believe there's some higher truth and higher being. Understand, and this is what we should be doing. So that's, I think, the most fundamental. I think also that, as a researcher, I really am excited when I can find the truth of the proposition, evidence to say that what they're saying is completely incorrect and it's the right way to go. And I like the ability to engage in debate on these issues. But I think basically is, we don't have the privilege of being up and bringing power over to them without even a fight. There are lives at stake, and even our own lives at some point. Certainly millions of people around the world, and it's the least we can do to go to an occasional protest or to register our opposition to the insanity. We can make believe it's going to be hopeless. A lot of times, I say that myself, but you do it because it's the right thing to do, and because maybe there's a chance that lives will be saved. And at the very minimum, you're not going to be complicit in attack against humanity.
Now the conversation has taken an explicit turn toward morality. First of all, David, it's so wonderful to sit at your feet again, as it were. So very nice. And so the first part of my question has to do with bringing the theories and the science of a successful movement into conversation with peace studies and peace building principles. And then the second is a question about how we do that transnationally. So in terms of the first part, I'm thinking about the principles of successful movements as you've articulated them, and then in relationship to our principle of focusing on and listening to and taking the lead from those mostly directly impacted by the violence that we abhor and that we seek to help transform so that we don't continue to produce violence, right? So in that sense, we have among us here in the United States of America, directly impacted people who are organizing while terrified and while under duress. So I'm just curious how you would consider, we conceptualize what seems to be this moral, I'm being a theologian here, but as this moral urging to come alongside those most directly impacted with these principles of an effective movement to garner large-scale support, as we just discussed. Right? So that's the first one. And then secondly, so I'm thinking with, as we're working to decolonize our peace building here in the United States of America, I'm thinking with immigrant-led social processes here that, and those who are leading and participating are coming from the global South. And they're here because they've been directly impacted by US economic and military intervention, of course, in countries of origin, and bring with them enormous amounts of expertise and are themselves embodying transnational movements because they're organizing here and they're coming from the global South and the movement experiences there. So I'm wondering about the potential to kind of think with that transnationality, as it were, to bring to bear this conversation we've been having about movements in the US to confront authoritarianism along with those two.
Well, yeah, there's a lot there. Yeah, Jana, we've always worked side by side. Some of you don't know that when we met at Goshen College when I was teaching over there, and I had come back from 8-10 years or longer in Columbia, and I needed a TA for my class. Do that, and I told her at the second go from the get-go, this is a co-teaching because I can learn a lot from you and the students as well. So we work together a lot and great mutual respect over decades now. So you've mentioned basically what are the question of solidarity. Activist movements in the past is the way it was understood, and it's still a relevant concept, that we stand and feed and alongside those who are the victims of these policies. And saw that a lot in the Central America movement and other movements that come along. Even now, the US Catholic leadership just had its pilgrimage to Hiroshima and Nagasaki. We're going to see and talk with and learn from those who are the victims of atomic bombing. And from that, we gain knowledge and perspective that enables us to carry forward, even when we have those tough existential questions about meaning. We see the potential suffering, we interact with those who are the victims, and that empowers us to continue to spread along. So in a way, it helps us. But I do think, and there's the concrete question of how do we organize our movements and our campaigns to be able to address these urgent critical needs. Migrant communities today, African American people generally, and that's not always been easy, and peace movements have not responded very well on this. When I was active, one of the ways that I was trying to do that is to seek and follow the leadership of African American leaders of that community. Dr. King, but certainly Reverend Jackson and some of the King children and others. Always took privilege their perspective to listen to them, to find out what is their view in terms of how we move forward. I was listening to an interview with Hushie Coates, and it's a different perspective, but it's one we need to think about and listen to, from an experience of centuries of oppression from this community. Oh, sorry, it's a long-winded way, but I think in terms of the immigrant issue, I think about a wonderful example right here on campus. Some years ago when the immigrant students organized and got us all mobilized to that the early wave of attacks against immigrants, so we could work together against that. So I do think it's respecting and following leadership from communities that have been on the receiving end of many of these repressive policies. Recognizing that we need diverse coalitions, diversity, and that we, if we're in a movement on these issues and we don't have people around the table who are from these communities, we have to start rethinking, find ways to bring them in and work with them. They probably already are doing things. Maybe we should go follow their leadership. Goes our way. These are really tough issues, and the peace movement has traditionally been weak in this area. Tried to address it a lot in my career. We didn't get as far as we need to.
Jump in real fast and just say that dramatic arts, literary arts, film, theater, painting even, often engages us through a perspectival shift. And I mention that because what I've been seeing is that like this Bad Bunny bullshit, right? He shouldn't be, Lee Greenwood should be, the Super Bowl halftime guy. That's an unserious yet serious, in the same way that the Ride of the Valkyries moment in Apocalypse Now is sort of a joke that's not a joke. It's a move to delegitimize his artistry and his voice and his platform. It's a move to delegitimize or take away the status of Puerto Rico as a territory of the United States in some ways, as the way I see it. So it's not just delegitimizing though, it's actually saying, no, you don't get to participate in this conversation, even though you might be in the United States legally. You don't get to participate in this conversation. You're not American, right? You don't get to participate in this conversation because you don't have the right politics or whatever it is, or you went to a university that has a particular kind of profile. So that's why I'm looking at the literary arts and journalism as a way of leaning into the diversity in such a way that, if there's one thing that never fails to surprise me, it's the diversity within our military. Muslim, Jews, Catholics, non-denominational, atheists, right? No atheists in foxholes, right? But like when I meet people from the military and they come from a background that I assume they're coming from, like places where I come in central Illinois, Keough, Illinois, I'm assuming they're coming from these old Rust Belt places where there's not a lot of, prospect. It's not true. It's just not true. One of the people I admire the most, who's become a colleague and friend, former Marine Phil Klay, Klay. He's Catholic. He's written a number of books, including a novel about his time spent in Afghanistan as a Marine. He says, he was these are just not people that I ever thought that I would. It doesn't put them in categories. So I think the more that we can, it doesn't take the place of the kind of organizing hard work and that Dave's talking about. But we need to be putting in front of people these perspectival shifts, or these, because they completely undercut our expectations. And once we start to see that we are very much what the idea, right? That we are this diverse nation of immigrants, and continue to be and will continue. And I think it's hard to turn away from, especially if you construct narratives in which you are humanizing all the characters and all of the players, and not just the ones that fit our politics.
We have 3 more hands up, so let's take them all together and then one final response. The back of the room. Your name is David too.
Oh, I'm a same era as David. I was an undergraduate here when the students took over the administration, building. You're familiar with that. I'm not a student or a scholar of peace. I just have more sense. At that era, it seemed as if a broad movement could influence, I'm interested in the politics of organization for change. And it seemed at that time, a broad movement had a lot of power to move the politics. Now, my sense is it's a little harder. We're looking at 5 or 6 districts, and a lot of districts set congressionally that will never change under the current law. So I wonder if that makes a difference in the organization for change, the broad movement as opposed to targeting specific areas, or does the broad movement well over enough to target the areas that need to be changed to get political change?
Thanks. Let's take 2 more and then, so Anne.
Continuing on with the idea about undercutting expectations, one of the things that I've learned over my decades here at Kroc is to change some of my stereotypes coming in as a sort of a peace activist, realizing from people like David and Lisa and others, oh, there's folks in the military that are also working on these issues, that it's not an either or, it's not peace or war. And Notre Dame has a long tradition of that between Father Hesburgh's advocacy, the ROTC program. There's various ways that Notre Dame has tried to cut those divisions or blend those areas. One thing that you said though, maybe David Griffith, when you were talking about the reporting on like people who are embedded with the military and reporting on the experience of folks in the military, and this may also speak to your origin stories, David, of how you became aware of things. Reporting, interviewing bomber pilots, for example, that is now no longer possible because of the new regulations that the only people reporting in the military are people who are going to be representing the military. You can't even report on the stories, much less get in there and interview. I'm wondering if we need different strategies now to both reach folks in the military. I love the posters that you displayed, David, about helping people think, but will that reach people? Are there different strategies we need to reach the folks in the military to help them question what their total allegiances are? And how do we represent their experiences to others so that we break that divide without, when we have these now barriers to the kind of reporting that might have been done in your era, David?
Thank you. And then one final.
I have a question about the search for truth and going on the streets or joining social movements. I'm German Russian and I study in the United States of America, so I'm so torn apart between all positions. Germany, when I look at Germany, it's ruled by a racist BlackRock lobbyist, and the second strongest party is the far right, and they speak about Russia being the enemy. And then I look to Russia, don't need to say who they're ruled by, and everyone is the enemy everywhere. I don't even know who to stand up for and who to believe. What truth are we talking about? I look at the numbers like NATO's budget, Russia's budget, but Russia threatening with nuclear strikes, and the United States of America portrays everyone as their enemies. I don't even know what to think. So who to stand up for, which democracy to protect, which social movement to join, what to do.
Not an easy set of things to read.
Got another hour. I'll just, some responses. I think, Dave, in terms of the Vietnam movement, the power to move politics was really very limited. All during the war, not even up to 1972, we never won any votes in the Congress. No. But the cumulative impact of 10 years of constant protests began to have impacts in local levels. So you began to see people who would run for Congress in order to stop the war. And the best example is Ron Dellums, who was the congressman from Oakland and Berkeley, former military guy himself. And he ran for Congress, and when he got into Congress, he did everything he could to help end it. And then there were, by then, dozens, and then it became a majority. And that speaks to the question of targeted areas. Even then, Congress was jerry-rigged in such a way that it's not very representative. It's hard to really influence the whole Congress. And it's certainly true today, but there are lots of places where there are elections. And there are primary elections that are going to be going on. And my view is mobilize in the elections. If you're in a district where you've already got somebody who's totally with you, or it's an impossibility and there's no way to change it, then work with colleagues in another district, in another part of the state or something. Working in a targeted political way, though, is absolutely essential. And I do believe and hope that we'll have another question. On the question of dealing with the military that Anne raised, yeah, they're trying to limit how we can talk to the military, but you can't ultimately stop that. The National Guard people are out in the streets in DC and Chicago and Portland. There are opportunities to talk to them, and they're in groups, whatever, half a dozen. So why not have an equal number of civilians who are well trained and disciplined and has a few veterans and active duty among themselves and have a conversation? This thing of it's not what I signed up for, that's real. And I think there's still possibilities for making that happen. When we were in the military, you couldn't communicate very well, but we had civilians who offered to help us. When I sued the Army, I had civilian lawyers. Otherwise, that never would have happened. And there's lots of lawyers now who are trying to reach out to Guard members and others to say, this is an illegal order. And under the Military Code of Justice, you have a right to refuse an illegal order. Now, lots of luck in trying to do it in reality, and that's where you need the lawyer. The Just one last point. I think your point about truth, yeah, there are so many truths. There are so much disinformation and misinformation that's flying about. But, you know, we can hold on to core truth. We know what democracy is. It's freedom of expression. It's the ability to elect your own leaders. And Russia has elections, but it's not democracy. We know that. US still has something, but it's eroding rapidly. There are right-wing parties, of course. But this is where, for me, nonviolence is foundational. And people would say, well, Gandhi, he said, I don't have any absolutes. Yes, he did. It was nonviolence, believe in nonviolence. And I would say that about myself. If we act nonviolently in a way that doesn't harm other people, and that is searching for whatever truth there may be in the other side's argument, that we can find some semblance of the truth. Absolute truth, of course, we are not going to find, but we can know what direction we can take. We know when something is more democratic or less democratic, and more violent or less violent. We can make those choices on a daily basis, and not in terms of big governments, but in terms of people. There are politicians in the Bundestag who are very good. How can we work with them and support? Just one last example. When the war started in the full-scale invasion in 22, there were hundreds of thousands of Russians who fled from the draft. And then there were starting to be hundreds, probably thousands who deserted. And I was contacted by some of them and tried to work with them. And it was very hard to get any sympathy for that, especially in Western Europe. There was no European government, except for France finally came around, would actually accept Russian deserters to come in, which I think was a huge mistake.
52 in total.
Say?
52 in total in the European Union.
Yeah.
2022.
Yeah.
Thank you all so much for joining us today. Let's thank David and David, Professor